who was also raised in the South. I lived in a majority white, rural, emerging suburb. I had close connections to family in segregated communities though. So before Code Switch was a NPR show, it was something I did Monday through Friday and then every weekend. I'm a graduate of historically Black college and university undergrad, and then did medical school residency and 2 fellowships at predominantly white institutions. So I'm a community psychiatrist, an educator, a physician advocate, an entrepreneur, and an intrapreneur, meaning I've started programs at Morehouse School of Medicine. And as a high school student in rural Northwest Florida, I was a beneficiary of a program, a government program for minority and rural students. I got research honors for medical school, trained at a Harvard program, and then did 2 fellowships. And so what's ahead? We're going to define some key terms, identify examples of historical and structural aspects of racism against Black Americans, explore ongoing iterations of racism and discrimination in contemporary American society, examine ramifications in Black mental health and substance use disorders, and discuss ways to be part of the solution. So it's always good to level set with some definitions at the very beginning. And so from Ibram X. Kendi, race is defined here as a power construct of collected or merged difference that lives socially. So not a biological one, not a medical one, but a power construct. And hopefully that will be resoundingly clear by the end of our 45 minutes together. Racism is defined as a marriage of racist policies and racist ideas that produces and normalizes racial inequities. Note that there is an absence of someone wanting to be a bad person or someone wanting to intentionally harm someone else. This is about something that produces and has a result that is inequitable. And that is how we're describing racism here. And then structural racism, and this was lifted from an article by Dr. Nancy Krieger, is the totality of ways in which societies create and maintain racial inequity via mutually reinforcing inequitable systems that in turn reinforce discriminatory beliefs, values, and distribution of resources and opportunities. And so when we're talking about those societal systems, these are the structures that we rely on to keep us going. So education, housing, economic, criminal justice, all of those things would be included there. Racial disparity, a difference in health status by race. And racial inequity, disparities in health that are a result of systemic, avoidable, and unjust social and economic policies and practices that create barriers to opportunity. So note here, a lot of times when we have these discussions, we use the word disparity as if it's some difference that we don't know what the origin is. But often if we look hard enough, we'll see there really aren't disparities in medicine, there are inequities in medicine, there are inequities in mental health. And if we do some critical thinking, we can find avoidable and unjust policies that are driving, that are creating and maintaining those differences. In mental health, often in the mental health care field and in medicine, there's more of a deficit model. We focus more on illness. And so I thought it was useful to talk about what mental health is. And it's not merely the absence of symptoms, or the decrease of symptoms, but it has its own standalone definition, and this is from the World Health Organization. So a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. So in looking at that definition, there are a lot of things that are going to have interplay with the larger society, with what those stresses of life look like, depending on where you live and what you experience, and that are going to tie into things like education and the employment system. So it's not just some clinical thing that happens in the confines of encounter, but it's something that has to do with how you're interacting with your community, with your family, and with the larger society. So for our very first webinar as this center, why is it that we're talking about racism? Why aren't we talking about schizophrenia or depression or something like that? Well, racism and people's experience of it in this society is something that's important for all of us, but it's something that we certainly can't ignore when it comes to the mental health of Black Americans. James Baldwin said, if you're treated a certain kind of way, you become a certain kind of person. If things are described to you as being real, they're real for you, whether they're real or not.
Which doll is the black doll? And which one is the white doll? Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the nice doll? And which doll is the bad doll? And why is that doll pretty?
Because she's white and she has 2 eyes.
Which doll is the ugly doll? Why is that doll ugly?
Because he's black.
Which doll looks most like you?
Like me.
Yeah, which one looks like?
And that one.
Okay.
That doll.
So I play that clip because as we think about the definition of mental health, what does it mean to be exposed to negative images of people who look like you, who relate to you from such an early age, that sink in from such an early age? What are some of the implications that could have for your mental well-being? So we have the narrative and the ideas part of racism that's displayed in that clip. And now we're gonna move a little bit into sort of policies and systems. So social factors play an important role in development and maintenance of both wellness and illness. And structural racism shapes every system in America, driving inequities, not merely disparities. So in our book, Social Injustice and Mental Health, one of the things we talk about is how social justice is the determinant of the social determinants of mental health. That when we look at the social determinants like homelessness, housing, food insecurity, adverse features of the built environment, adverse early life experiences, low education, poor employment opportunities, that all of those things that we know impact mental health are themselves impacted by our public policies and our social norms. That those norms and those policies provide the framework that set those inequities up that we know then have downstream negative impacts on people's mental health outcomes. So it's not just about the determinants, but it's about the structural racism and inequities that create those differences in the first place. And when it comes to health, we know that very little of it, actually 20%, goes back to healthcare. Most of it is related to health behaviors, the physical environment, and socioeconomic factors. And even though we see that 30% that goes with health behaviors, there are very clear ties between socioeconomic factors and the behaviors that people have available to them in terms of those health behaviors. So some of that 30% could be chalked up to that 40% as well. So we really can't talk about anybody's mental health, including Black people's mental health, without thinking about socioeconomic factors. As a child psychiatrist, of course, I think about things from a developmental standpoint, and there are things that we know provide a foundation for mental well-being. These include safety, the availability of a consistent invested caregiver for children, financial stability, food security, housing security, inclusion, perinatal and prenatal health, educational opportunities, and access to appropriate care. So as I'm going through talking about structural racism in our society, I welcome you to come back to this and think about ways that these critical factors may be undermined by in our society, we know that there are clear differences in poverty, unemployment, and health uninsurance by race. And again, these are inequities that are by structural design that have a historical context for them. They aren't just differences that happened. But when we're talking about African Americans, we have a poverty rate of 25.4%, an unemployment rate of 11.3%, and an uninsurance rate of 11%. one of the things that comes up during these discussions is people wanting to point to progress and saying, well, things aren't what they used to be. And so I find it helpful to come back to the words of Dr. Frantz Fanon, who was a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, and political philosopher. So someone who would be good to lend his voice to this conversation. And he said, once and for all, I will state this principle: a given society is racist or it is not. And so let's go to where we started. And so I have the caveat that this is in the US, since we are talking about African Americans, but there are elements of this in other societies as well. I wish that I could take all of you to the Whitney Plantation, which is in Louisiana. I went there and it was truly a transformative experience for me, but we're going to use YouTube and some technology to give you a bit of an idea of what's there. It is the only plantation in the United States where it is told, the plantation story is told from the perspective of the enslaved people.
Well, you have to remember that we live under a tremendous weight of slavery now. And this isn't Black history we're talking about. This is our national history. It's my history, it's your history. People have been lynched, slaves. You went to the army and wasn't respected, had to sit in the back of a bus. We need federal legislation to get you into a school to get an education. All of these things. So when you see Robert E. Lee on a column 80 feet tall, the man who wanted to retain slavery, it offends you. You've got two sides, and Blacks are screaming prejudice to the white side. And the white side is looking and saying, why don't they get over it? Why can't they get over it? And the Blacks don't understand that the whites don't know what the it is, what the IT is. We're trying somehow here to define the it. And unless you know what the it is, don't ask the question, why can't they get over it?
Tu l'as été aussi d'origine africaine, tu le dis. C'est comme ça que ça c'est la Constitution française. 50 ans, African, a été vendu à Etienne Villeray, free colored man. Etienne, you need something.
When they leave, be sure that they toll that bell once for the slave, wherever there's a bell.
Okay.
Notice I can't read right. When I was brought up, if my boss man catch me with a pencil or paper, it was 25 lashes. John McDonald. Over the last 16 years, we have been working on the Whitney Plantation. This plantation was built in 1790. The plantation was settled by Ambrose Heidel, and this property was available for sale. And for the first year, I just wrapped everything in plastic because it was only a real estate investment for me. But it was very shocking to me that I did not know about slavery. And I knew slaves were here, of course. I had no idea what a commodity they were and how they were treated as a commodity. I had no idea of how deprived they were, not by force of circumstance, but by deliberate planning.
Like the sheriff of the parish or the head of the militia would have something like this, to lock up runaway slaves until the master comes and claim them and pay the fees for feeding and watering. They always refer to those slaves as animals. And even the runaway slaves, they use the name Maroon. Maroon is from Cimarron, and Cimarrones are wild pig, And this was part of slave control. My name is Ibrahim Asek. I met John Cummings in 2000, and he decided to hire me to be the director of research of this project. The fact of going into the archives and digging all those names and taking them back to life, everybody who comes here would know that Abdou from Senegal was a slave here. He died in 1836. You don't just teach slavery. These people have backgrounds. They came from Africa. But also you have to know that these people came maybe naked or half naked, but they did not need a suitcase to put the culture inside. When you say blues, jazz, rock and roll, Zydeco, they know it all over the country and they like it. It is rooted into slavery. People need to understand what happened on these plantations. It is not just a way of putting the guilt on someone. No, we don't need that. We need to understand today why we have so many problems in America, why so many people are in jail, why so much poverty, Black people being shot and killed like game. All that was rooted in slavery. And if you don't understand the source of the problem, how can we solve it?
What people have to realize.
So getting to that source of the problem, and there are a few things in there I want to point out. One was the fact that people received lashes for trying to read. So there was this very early discouragement from educational achievement or from learning that these people experienced. The owner's comment was not by force of circumstance, but by deliberate planning, something that also has implications for today's society. And also him talking about how law enforcement was used to gather and catch runaway enslaved people. And to think about those as we go through some of the things that are happening in present day society. So coming back to this people for profit and people being a commodity. So when you talk about slavery in the United States, this was a race-based caste system seen in every US territory, but with more demand in the South. So by 1815, the domestic slave trade had become a major economic activity in the United States and lasted until the 1860s. And what we saw here was the second Middle Passage. So often there's more emphasis on people being brought from Africa to the United States. There's less emphasis on people being bred here in the United States, families being ripped apart and people being sold within the confines of the United States. And I recently read an autobiography of Shirley Chisholm, and she talks about this being a injury that was somewhat unique to Black US Americans as opposed to the Caribbean because of the space over which families were dispersed. So less than 5% of Africans brought to the Americas were actually brought to the modern day US. But by 1860, the number of enslaved people was up to 4 million people. So that just gives you an idea of how people were being bred and sold and what a big business this was. This wasn't just a matter in the South. By 1822, half of New York City's exports were related to cotton. So this was a key part of the American economy, not just the Southern economy. And because of that, even after, as the nation was being built, that economic power translated into political power. 50 of the 72 years between Washington and Lincoln, the US had a slaveholder as president, and we continue to see the economic and political impact of slavery, really not with that power resting with the enslaved people, but with the people who benefited financially from their labor. Sometimes there is pushback when you talk about the Civil War and racism and what it was about. And so I find it's always useful to go back to the source and think about what was being thought at the time and how this thought may be continued through in what we see in present day. So we're going to go to the words of Alexander H. Stephens. He was the vice president of the Confederacy from 1862 to 1865. So he was part of the group that tried to overthrow the government. And afterward also, he was elected to the US Senate, though he wasn't seated. However, he was elected and served as a US House representative for Georgia and elected and served as the governor of Georgia. And I think that's important to point out because this man wasn't put into jail. He wasn't put into exile. He wasn't shunned by society for trying to commit treason against the United States. He was elected to office again and again. So there wasn't this light bulb moment where people said, oh, that was a really wrong way for me to think, and now I see the light. This is someone who was continued to be put forth as a leader. And these are his words about what the Civil War was concerning. And so he said, the new Constitution, this is the Constitution of the Confederacy, has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institutions, African slavery as it exists among us, the proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization. This was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. So he's telling you, this is why we're at war. The prevailing ideas entertained by Jefferson and most of the leading statesmen at the time of the formation of the old Constitution were that the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle, socially, morally, and politically. It was an evil they knew not well how to deal with, but the general opinion of the men of that day was that somehow or other, in the order of providence, the institution would be evanescent and pass away. Those ideas, however, were fundamentally wrong. So this idea that slavery would go away or be dealt with in some way that would make it just magically disappear. Those ideas, however, were fundamentally wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of races. This was an error. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite ideas. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and moral condition. This is a man who was elected to office multiple times. So when you have someone who thinks like that in position of power, shaping policy, being elected by constituents, what does it mean for the people who he has said are not equal to the Black man and whose natural place is one of subordination? So again, it's helpful to go back to a source, and of course, Frederick Douglass, someone who was enslaved at a point in his life who became an abolitionist, talked about how it impacted him to be in a society where this was the reality. And he said, I have observed this in my experience of slavery, that whenever my condition was improved, instead of its increasing my contentment, it only increased my desire to be free and set me to thinking of plans to gain my freedom. I have found that to make a contented slave, it is necessary to make a thoughtless one. It is necessary to darken his moral and mental vision, and as far as possible, to annihilate the power of reason. He must be able to detect no inconsistencies in slavery. He must be made to feel that slavery is right, and he can be brought to that only when he ceased to be a man. And again, as a child psychiatrist, this makes me think about development and how the stories told by the people in charge impact how you see yourself and how you see the world. There's this phenomenon we see in child psychiatry where when people are abused by caregivers, rather than understanding that the caregiver is wrong, they believe that there's something that is inherently bad or defective about them that is eliciting that response from the caregiver. And this is part of what we can see in a society that consistently treats a certain group of people, devalues a certain people in a way that leads them to feel and to be unsafe. So how far we've come versus where we remain. So the Whitney Plantation is in the state of Louisiana. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that are happening there in present day America. On the very bottom is a picture of the Angola prison farm. In the middle was a parade, and you can see that all of the students at this particular school marching in this parade are white, and on the top is a young infant. So the Angola prison farm is named Angola because it was a plantation where most of the people who were working it were from what was known as the country of Angola. It became a prison farm now, and so it's no longer a plantation, but it's a place where you still have predominantly Black people who are the descendants of enslaved people who are working this farm, not getting paid to do it, who are still, for the most part, overseen by Southern white men. In my capacity as a forensic psychiatrist, I ended up visiting Angola to see someone. And it really was like stepping into a time warp. So they still have houses on the grounds that some of the guards live in and raise their family in. 80% of the men who are there currently are Black men. So as you're watching people who are going out and doing work, it's Black workers and white men in charge. And one of the most striking things to me was the graveyards. So getting to that dehumanization piece, even in death, it was present. So on their markers for their grave sites, it doesn't include their name. It includes their prison number. And this is something that is happening in present day US. School segregation continues to be an issue in this country. We know that there was a Supreme Court case and it was ruled that this is something that we shouldn't be doing in our society. But one of the things that struck me when I was in New Orleans and watching a parade is that every band was either all Black or all white. And so it got me to thinking about segregation. And in the US in 2017, 7 of 10 Black students attend majority Black schools and 7 of 10 Black students attend high poverty schools. So we know that desegregation is not the law on paper, but it is the reality according to the Economic Policy Institute. And infant mortality. What we saw with enslaved people was that there was a high rate of infant mortality, not because of some inherent genetic deficiency of Black people, but because of the conditions in which they were forced to live. Present day, in Louisiana, the rate of infant mortality among non-Hispanic Black infants is more than double the rate of non-Hispanic white infants. And so there are ways that our society has been constructed and built, that our resources have been allocated, that have not only separated people and dehumanized them, but also concentrated wealth away from Black communities. And one example of this is redlining. And something I want to point out about that clip is that 98% number. So this is a federal loan program. You have people of all races contributing to the tax base, but 98% of those federal loans went to white families. So Black Lives Matter, or do they? And of course, I have a picture of Trayvon Martin here. But as we know, I could update this slide with a new face every month. Unarmed victims of police killings are more likely to be minorities. They are more likely to be Black. This is despite the fact that, of course, by general population numbers, they are not the majority. So how is this okay? How does this happen? And we still have to debate whether we're going to do something as a society. We did recently see where one of our legislative bodies is passing a bill aimed at police reform, but it's unclear if it's going to make it through. And part of how that is supported and allowed to continue is this interplay between the narrative and the public policy. So there are messages of inferiority about Black people that we saw made evident in the doll video with the young children. They're getting those from somewhere, and they're getting them from lots of places all the time. And it's really an inescapable fact of American society that you see these indicators of what is desired, what is clean, what is good, what is bad, and that there's this racialization of those things. So whether it's a Dove ad that shows the white person as the clean one, or the Time magazine cover that makes O.J. Simpson darker once he's accused of murder, or the L'Oreal ad that makes Beyonce, who's already a fairly light-skinned woman, lighter because that is more beautiful. There are these messages of who is worthy. And even when you look at how we think about behavior and how we talk about people who have created, people who've been victims of criminal acts or people who have perpetuated them, that there is this desire to frame white people who commit crime as mentally ill and Black people as inherently angry and violent. And an example of this is a study that actually looked at how news agencies cover white shooters versus unarmed Black people who were killed. And what they saw is that the media coverage of white murderers was more sympathetic and more humanizing than the coverage of Black people who had been murdered. And this has implications not only in media or ads, but it has it in the criminal justice system as well. Police brutality and police violence gets a lot of attention. It's what can be captured by video. It is what is most dramatic and what goes viral. But the reality is that is one piece of a system where structural racism permeates it. Data shows that in our criminal justice system, there are higher sentences for Blacks compared to whites. And this is after you control for history and severity of crime. And not only is there different sentencing by race, there's a difference that's more pronounced by shade. So for medium and dark-skinned Blacks, it's even worse. And this difference holds true even after controlling for socioeconomic status. So a lot of times what you'll hear people do is conflate race and poverty. And it's true that there are racialized aspects of it, but they are not one and the same, and that there is a different implication of being Black and of being darker skinned. And we see this in our media and in our celebrities as well. The depictions that often win awards are ones where Black people are either enslaved or evil or entertainers, because those are the boxes that they're allowed to be in. And we also see ways that Black voices are silenced, where you are expected to entertain, but not bring your full humanity to the picture, and consequences for doing that. So of course, Colin Kaepernick led his team to a Super Bowl and has not been able to get signed with the team, not because of what happened on the field, but because of how he used his voice. And Dave Chappelle, during a Grammy performance of rapper Kendrick Lamar, said, "I just wanted to remind the audience that the only thing more frightening than watching a Black man be honest in America is being an honest Black man in America." So there is this context that we are all aware of in this country of the consequences that can come with bringing your full self to a situation and with being honest about what you are experiencing and what you've gone through. So now we come to the school to prison pipeline. And again, I think it's always helpful to have concrete examples of how this works and what this looks like, because that's, again, one of these terms that gets really politicized and there can be some doubt around it. And hopefully this illustration will make it clear. So the outgoing former US Secretary of Education was interviewed by Leslie Stahl. And again, in terms of framing the narrative, this video used to be very readily available online. It is less so now. So I have to just tell you what they said. So Leslie Stahl is the journalist, the interviewer, and who was asking the Secretary of Education about schools in Michigan. And the reason she was asking about school in Michigan is because prior to being appointed to the US Secretary of Education position, Ms. DeVos had really shaped the schools there and been a big proponent, successfully so, for charter schools in Michigan. So the results of those schools were something that she should have understandably been held accountable for. So the US Secretary of Education said, "I don't know, overall, I can't say overall that they have all gotten better." Leslie Stahl says the whole state is not doing well. And the US Secretary of Education said, "Well, there are certainly lots of pockets where the students are doing well, and no, but your argument that if you take funds away that the schools will get better is not working in Michigan, where you had a huge impact and influence over the direction of the school system there." To which the Secretary of Education said, "I hesitate to talk about all schools in general because schools are made up of individual students attending them." Leslie Stahl, "The public schools here are doing worse than they did." The US Secretary of Education, "Michigan schools need to do better. There's no doubt about it." Leslie Stahl, "Have you seen the really bad schools? Maybe try to figure out what they're doing." I have not intentionally visited schools that are underperforming. Maybe you should. And the US Secretary of Education said, "Maybe I should, yes." In Detroit, Michigan, which is the major city of the state that this woman shaped the educational policy in, after her policies were pushed through around the time when she was appointed as Secretary of Education, Black males in Detroit public schools had a 23% graduation rate. A 23% graduation rate. And this was in charge of national policy. If you're a Black man in America and you do not graduate from high school, you have a 60% chance of ending up incarcerated. This is by design. So this, of course, matters for mental health and matters for the mental health of the African-American community. And these are just some examples. When blue-collar jobs disappear, the war on some drug users, ACEs and intergenerational trauma, the ramifications of racism, and when the trauma is not post. So we see striking parallels between the opioid epidemic and the cocaine epidemic, where unemployment and not having good job opportunities have fueled these things, along with increased availability of addictive substances. But we've seen really significant differences. And I want to point out that cocaine-related overdose deaths among non-Hispanic Blacks are on par currently with overdose deaths caused by heroin and prescription opioids among whites. But that has received much less government attention, funding for treatment, physician advocacy, or sympathetic media coverage. So that part about funding for treatment and government attention is part of the structural racism, that because this is something that is affecting a group that is devalued, addressing this issue isn't given the same attention, even though death rates are similar. And so now we go into the war on drugs, which I've called the war on some drug users, and I will, for the sake of time, skip the clip, but there are significant inequities in who goes to jail for using illegal drugs. So we know that in this country, if you ask people, do you use illegal drugs? They tell you they use them at about the same rate across race. We know they do not go to jail at about the same rate for drug-related crimes. So drug-related arrests per 100,000 residents of each race, you have 879 for Black versus 332 for white. So what this is showing you is that behavior is differentially criminalized, even if the behavior is not all that different. There are racial disparities at arrest, indictment, conviction, and severity of sentence. And this leads to trauma and dehumanization within the criminal justice system, lost learning and vocational opportunities, the fraying of social nets and safety supports, or suboptimally treated mental illness, intergenerational impacts, harsher penalties if there are arrests, as we talked about earlier, and double or triple stigma that can go with racism, plus a felony conviction, plus there possibly being a substance use disorder. And we know that adverse childhood experiences impact people's health throughout that lifespan. And if you're differentially exposed to mass incarceration, trauma, poverty, because of all these structural issues, that is going to have implications for people's well-being. And the social exclusion, discrimination, and hostility encountered by Black people in this country has implications for treatment seeking and experiences. So we know that racism is a stressor that can drive mental health symptoms, but we also know that there's difficulty with accessing our system if we don't have resources. So those wealth and income gaps that we see by race lead to cost barriers to treatment. Once they get into treatment, if they are able to overcome those barriers, there is racism in clinical settings, inequities in access, there may be fear of double stigma and cultural chasms between the people who are providing care, designing clinical policies, and the people who are seeking help. And a personal example about the stress of racism, so it was something that I grew up with in Northwest Florida, and being able to be a student at Florida A&M University, a historically Black college, for my undergraduate experience was amazing for me because I had people who wanted me to succeed, who believed I could. I had Black teachers, and I remember having this experience of thinking, this must be what white people feel like all the time. I didn't realize how significant the burden of racism was on me until it was lifted. And when the trauma is not post. It's a clip of a young Black boy playing basketball in his own front yard. And he was interrupted when a police officer drove by. When his dad asked him why he did that, he said, because they killed George Floyd. That's the nature of structural racism, is that it's part of your society and it's inescapable. So what is our part? And hopefully there's a part that you want to play to this. So this is the call to action, and it is absolutely your lane. This is Raymond Santana. He was one of the Central Park Five, now known as the Exonerated Five, was 14 years old when he was sentenced to death based on a false confession, spent 7 years of his life behind bars, and then had to spend another 12 years to get justice from the state of New York. I had the chance to interview him a couple years back. One of the things that he said as it relates to these issues is that we need all hands on deck. That you don't need to go to law school or become a legislator to address them, but there's a role for all of us to play. Arthur Ashe said, start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. And so taking action, and one last definition for you, and that is activist, one who has a record of power or policy change. So some common pitfalls are people saying things like, I don't see race. Well, what that really says is that you aren't acknowledging people's experiences and the reality of how navigating the society is different because of their skin. That is a microaggression. That is not a progressive thing to say. Conflating training with action. So what we see is that people have talks or they have trainings or they talk about implicit bias and they think that they have done their part. No, doing your part is actually doing things that result in more equitable outcomes by race in whatever capacity it is that you're working. Failing to measure and manage. So getting back to those outcomes, you can't know if you're actually making a difference if you're not measuring things by race and seeing if things are different. So we manage what we measure. So you have to have data by race and gather it by race. Having race neutral reforms for systems. So given that the default in American society is one of racism, your race neutral reform will just result in a racist system 2.0. Not giving people who are African-American seats at the table when you're talking about things impacting their community, or giving them a seat but no voice, and the minority tax. So asking the people who have the job responsibilities that all of your other employees do to do the extra minority work, not paying them for that time, not protecting them for that time, and not considering it in their promotion criteria. So taking action. It first starts with questioning disparity and looking for and asking, where's the racial inequity? What is the driver of this? Avoiding erasure of context, so examining systemic drivers that are contributing to what you're seeing. Leveraging your privilege and your resources. So all of us have some degree of privilege. Yes, as a dark-skinned Black woman in a racist, colorist, sexist society, there are things where I am not in a position of privilege, but as a physician, there are certainly ones where I am. And the same applies to you in some way. And then lastly, prepare for retrenchment. The current system has served some quite well. There are people who will not like your work, and there are people who will try perhaps to discredit you or the way that you say it. Understand that that is part of the process. And for those of you who are members of the African-American community, I just wanted to implore you to think about and to protect yourself as you do this work. Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. When you look at what has been thrown at this community and what this community is up against, your survival, your protection is a radical idea and concept. So understand that caring for yourself is part of the work. And lastly,
Okay, y'all ready?
Can I get an amen? And welcome to the very first National Oprah Winfrey Show!
So the story of Black people in America is not just one of oppression and trauma, it is also one of resilience and excellence. And with that, we will go into our discussion. Thank you all so much.
That was very, very powerful. Thank you so much for an amazing presentation, Dr. Vincent. And everyone have some amazing comments. I know that you weren't able to see any of them, but everyone said this was eye-opening. It was very informative. People are asking for a part 2. So of course, you know, I'll be reaching out. They just had some amazing resources that they dropped in the chat. And so one of the things I was trying to keep up with all of the resources is because our staff will put those resources together and just have them out there, excuse me, for individuals for additional information if you would like that. But one question that was in the chat that I was able to keep up with, and it was from Kimberly Betez. And if anyone else have any more questions, we have a few more minutes, you can put it in the chat. But she indicated, what do you recommend? Do you have any additional resources for how to address the things that we see in our places of work who may not be ready to listen?
Yes, so thank you for that question. And it gets to that action, and I'm glad you're thinking about action. And so one of the things that is important in workplaces is simple acknowledgement, because we can't address an issue that we haven't acknowledged. And so if things aren't being named, you can be part of that naming process. And if you're in a position of privilege in some way, you being part of that naming process is even that much more important. We have to be aware of power differentials, and we have to be willing to lend our voice in situations that may be uncomfortable for us, keeping in mind that you, if you're in a position of privilege, may be able to opt out, whereas your Black coworkers, your Black clients, the Black people you say that you serve, this is part of their daily experience. They don't have the option to opt out. And so true allyship, true service means that you opt in to being part of the solution too, which means there's going to be some uncomfortable moments and maybe some risks involved in doing that.
Thank you, Dr. Vincent. And also people are asking if this recording will be available, and it will be available next week on our website. I've posted our website in the chat several times, but I'll do that again in a moment. And also to make sure that we can continue this, you know, as part of our funding, we have to do an evaluation. We've also put the evaluation link in there. So after the presentation, if you'll be so kind and complete the evaluation, we'll be grateful for that. Let me see if we have any more. One of the things that I failed to mention is that Dr. Vincent is also the medical director. So she is a part of the African American Behavioral Health Center of Excellence. So this will not be your last time seeing her. But if you have any questions or anything, please feel free to reach out. I don't see any more questions. People were just asking, they wish this could have been longer. Do you see one, Celine?
Yeah, I've captured all questions that were answered. The first question, Dr. Vincent, that was asked was, how do we get this effective training, air quotes, education into school systems? All public and private teachers, admin staff, educational policymakers at all levels, federal, state, local, and community level need to receive this type of information.
So I agree, we need it there, but I go back to that Arthur Ashe quote, because this can feel so big, we don't know where to start, but I say start in your neighborhood, start with your child's school, start in your community, because that is where you're going to have those relationships, and that's where you're going to have more leverage. So there is nothing wrong with starting small, even though our goal is that eventually this is everywhere.
Thank you. The next question was, how can I find legitimate resources that aren't whited out? Air quotes on that, if you know what I mean by that.
Sure, I do. So some ones I would say are definitely How to Be an Anti-Racist by Kendi. The 1619 Project by the New York Times is a great resource, and they have both the articles and the podcast if you're a podcast person. The book that Dr. Shim and I edited, Social Injustice and Mental Health, it's not a Black specific book, but as you can imagine, there is a lot of data about Black people in American society, so it speaks to these issues and explores them in some greater depth. And one of the other things that I will say is look up things about your state or your community, right? So I live in Atlanta, and there's a lot of data and information about redlining in Atlanta. and the lack of upward mobility of people who are born poor there. So there's a lot of publicly available information about inequities where you live that it's helpful for you to be aware of as well.
Do we have time for another question? I know it's right on at, do you have time for one more question?
Yes, I think this is a really good one if Dr. Vincent has time. Celine, what do you think of that controversial JMA tweet and podcast on structural racism that was released on yesterday? If you saw that tweet or podcast.
I actually did not see it, so I'll have to look for that. So we can talk about that in part 2.
Okay, part 2, Daphne.
So the next question, do you have any advice for Black students who attend predominantly white and private university?
Yes, so one of the things that we know is protective in those settings is to be part of an affirming community. So finding your, I see a comment that says, pray for them, I agree. But finding your community within that larger institution. And that may look like being part of national organizations. So for instance, I was pre-med when I was in school. There's a minority association of pre-health students. So looking for the communities there. The other thing that I'll say in those environments that's really important is being aware of the source and of seeking out other sources of information. So they may not lead you to Audre Lorde and James Baldwin and Frantz Fanon. You may have to go there yourself and understand that that's part of the process, and that's work that you're probably going to have to do on your own. I did 6 years of training after medical school. And I can tell you, I learned much more about Black psychology and Black mental health from James Baldwin and Audre Lorde than I did in that 6 years of training.
Thank you so much. One of the things that we can do is capture all of these questions, because as I'm looking at a lot of them, I think that it does serve us well to do a frequently asked questions, because there's some very powerful questions that are out there. But I want to be mindful of your time as well as Dr. Vincent's time. But we want to say thank you so much. We will have many more of these webinars. Please look at our website. It is under construction, but there is information about our center there. That's www.africanamericanbehavioralhealth.org. I am Dr. Don Tyus, and we're so thankful that you were here with us today. Until next time, have an amazing day. Thank you.